I believe we're ready to start, so thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan LaPerla, the Director of Programming here at the library, and it's an honor for me to welcome you today and to welcome our special guest speaker, Anthony Lake, to the 7th Annual Anita Houston Lecture. It was a proud moment in New Canaan Library's history when members of the UN Committee of New Canaan approached our leadership several years ago and asked if we would partner with them to establish this memorial lecture series. During the intervening years, through the diligent efforts of the committee and the generous support of friends in the community, the distinguished speakers, whose names you can read in the program, have come here to honor Anita's memory. Anita Houston was not only a unique individual of many talents, she was a true New Canaan treasure, as those of us who knew her can attest. I considered it a privilege when she invited me to be a member of her UN study group, an organization Anita passionately believed in and whose goals she served until the end. Now it is a pleasure for me to invite family members Emily Egan and Mariana Worth up to the podium to tell you more about this remarkable woman. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good afternoon. I'm Emily Egan.
And I'm Mariana Worth, and we are proud grandchildren of Anita Houston.
We are honored to be here on behalf of the Houston family at the 7th Annual Anita Houston Memorial Lecture. We are so grateful for this lecture series and how it keeps Anita's spirit alive in the town of New Canaan. For me, as a child, I remember Granny's house as a chaotic, exciting, bustling, busy, and always welcoming. She constantly opened her doors to international guests, as everyone here knows well. At a holiday table at Granny's, there was inevitably someone from China or Russia or Egypt telling fascinating stories from their countries, which for a child was a wonderful experience. And Granny was demanding, as I'm sure she was to those of you here as well. I remember Granny reading the New York Times page to page every day and quizzing us on international affairs and speaking from her heart about the countries that were distressing her.
And so it is very fitting to have Tony Lake, Executive Director of Unicef, here with us today. As I understand from my father and his siblings, Tony was always a favorite of Granny's. He was the epitome of the best and the brightest, and the joke was always that Granny really wanted Tony Lake for her son. In fact, just now at brunch, my dad and his sisters were reminiscing about how Tony's name would often be brought up at the dinner table. Our Granny would say, "Oh, did you hear what Tony Lake accomplished?" And this was always met with eye rolls, as Tony Lake was the preferred child. Mr. Lake also once mowed our Granny's lawn. In fact, he was not the only international affairs superstar to mow her lawn. Paul Bremer, ambassador and diplomat, also did Granny's yard work. And so it seems that in order to be successful in international affairs, you have to have done our Granny's yard work. We are so grateful to have Mr. Lake speaking here this afternoon and honoring our grandmother.
The Houston family would also like to thank the New Canaan Library and the UN Committee of New Canaan. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Pete Runette, co-chair of the UN Committee of New Canaan. I'd first like to acknowledge our partners, the New Canaan Library, particularly the director, Lisa Oldham, and Susan LaPerla, the programming director, whose enthusiastic support has been vital to our being able to offer the programs we do. Also vital is my co-chair of our UN Committee, Shakeba Wakili Bennett, who's brought us single-handedly into the Facebook and Twitter era. Lastly, I note the recent passing of my longtime co-chair, Al Naus, who was a dedicated fan of Anita's and a wonderfully gentle man. Capping nearly 50 years of public service, Tony Lake currently serves as the 6th Executive Director of the United Nations Children's Fund, or Unicef. The breadth of his distinguished public service is truly remarkable. His route to Executive Director of one of the most important humanitarian organizations in the world, focusing on the future of children, began in the Foreign Service with a series of critical assignments associated with the Vietnam War, including participation in the Paris peace talks. His path then moved to public policy as President Carter's policy planning director, and on to issues of war and peace and national defense during his service as President Clinton's national security advisor. Only Republican opposition prevented President Clinton from pursuing his nomination as director of CIA. He served both the Clinton and Obama presidential campaigns as senior foreign policy advisor, having been distinguished professor of diplomacy at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown in the interim. His relationship with Unicef dates from 1993, when he worked with a previous executive director and later served on the board of the U.S. Fund for Unicef, including as board chairman from 2004 to 2007. After growing up in New Canaan, where he attended public school in St. Luke's, he received a BA degree from Harvard, read international economics at Trinity College in Cambridge, and went on to receive his PhD from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. He's the author of a number of books and articles and a member of numerous boards and advisory committees. Please welcome back to New Canaan, Tony Lake.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be back here. I say back here both in New Canaan and in this room where I've spoken a number of times before. But it is a special treat, and people always say, what an honor, but it is an honor to give a talk in this series for Anita Houston, and I'm more than touched. I'm moved as I think back on the times with her. My sister Ann, who's here somewhere, and I drove around New Canaan this morning after we got here looking at old sites and places we'd lived and everything. And we had a great time, and the memories were all flooding back. And then we drove by the dreaded lawn at the Houston's house. And I have so many warm memories of all the Houstons, and that was great at lunch to see you all again. Then there are the memories of the lawn, and the gardens, and the trimming, and the Yellow Jacket hole, where Anita, with typical force of character, said, "Go out and get rid of those yellow jackets." I had no idea how to get rid of yellow jackets. All I can tell you is that if you pour gasoline down a Yellow Jacket hole and light it, it is not effective, but it is sure entertaining when it. So anyway, they're all very, very warm memories, and thank you so much for having me here. The previous times I've spoken, I have done it just from notes, which I generally prefer, but because this is a formal lecture, I wrote it down, and also because I used this occasion to think through some issues more systematically than I would if I did it by notes. I wouldn't be here, in fact, as the head of UNICEF if it were not for Anita. I'm quite sure of that, because through the strength of her passion for the United Nations, I got the bug early on. And I can't remember whether it was because my class at Sachs Junior High School or Center School or the Boy Scout troop, but I do remember that we went into to New York, our class, to visit the General Assembly and the Security Council at a time not that far now in retrospect from the founding of the United Nations, though at the time it seemed like it had been there forever. And I came back absolutely imbued with the spirit that Anita had for the United Nations, and I know if I had ever dared not have it, then I was in deep trouble with a woman who I admired so much, for whom I had such affection, and who scared the life out of me. So I've had that passion for the UN ever since, and that belief that the world and all of us needs a strong and effective United Nations. I want to thank your committee, Pete, for keeping Anita's passion alive and giving life to her belief that committed citizens can have a practical, direct impact on communities around the world, as you are doing in the demining work in a Cambodian village, funding schools in Afghanistan, with curriculum for Afghan girls, etc. Because you understand that when American citizens are engaged in the welfare of others, that has an impact on the welfare of American citizens. I know I've always believed, and especially as National Security Advisor, that every nation has the right and responsibility to protect its borders. It is also true that it will do so badly if it allows those borders to limit its sense of global responsibility. History has shown what happens when countries or communities focus solely on their self-interest, work within the limits of narrow ambitions and imaginations, collaborate only with those that share their particular values or ethnicity or tribal affiliation. Scorched by 2 world wars, saddled with the task of rebuilding a war-shattered Europe and Asia, the world had learned a costly lesson, that we achieve common goals only by taking common action on common principles. Principles that no one country nor people owns. Universal human principles that reflect not only abstractions like justice, but the common sense proposition that I am better off when I care for your welfare as you care for mine. Over the course of my life, my belief in the central importance of the UN has actually grown. As an organization that provides a place where countries can come together to discuss issues of war and peace, life and death, and the responsibility each nation has to its citizens of other nations as well as to its own. And as an organization that assists countries in urgent need. I have heard Secretary General Ban Ki-moon say more than once that he remembers with huge gratitude his childhood memories just after the Korean War of receiving from the United Nations and Unicef powdered milk and that most precious of all things, education. When I joined Unicef, I swore an oath not to represent my own country, but to reflect the interests of all countries. And I take that oath very seriously every day. But I'm also proudly an American, and one of the large majority of our citizens who understand that it is in America's best interests to play an active role in the United Nations. A poll just released by the Better World campaign in October showed that an overwhelming majority of Americans, 7 out of 10, believe that the UN remains very relevant today, and that nearly 9 in 10 believes the U.S. must maintain an active role in the organization, 90% of them. So you are not alone. They understand that our country's interests are best served when a UN peacekeeper, a member of a single, unified, internationally agreed-upon force of blue helmets, stands watch at, say, the Golan Heights to keep a peace that will help prevent further conflict in a very unstable part of the world that is extremely important to American interests. That if the UN were not there in Darfur, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in southern Lebanon, the U.S. would either have to act itself at great cost or fail to act with a cost both to our interests and to our conscience. Americans understand that our country's interests as well as ideals are well served when a UN humanitarian worker delivers food, water, and education in typhoon-ravaged areas in the Philippines or in Syria or in the Central African Republic, not only saving lives in the process, but promoting future economic progress and economic stability, deeply in the American interest. Or ask yourself, if the United Nations and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons were not working right now to remove chemical weapons from Syria, who could do the job? Certainly no individual country. And it's in the interest of all of us that UN health workers, facing daily dangers and too often even death, continue their fight to end the scourge of polio around the world, the disease that killed my friend Jerry Nickerson and crippled his mother right here in New Canaan when I was a boy. We almost have defeated polio. We must not let it get back infecting the world again. So is the UN sometimes a frustrating place? Do the rules and processes put in place by the member states seem onerous and constricting? Does talk sometimes masquerade as action? Are civil society groups not given the place at the UN table that they deserve but are too often denied? The answer to these questions is, of course, yes, and I certainly share these frustrations. But there's no question that the world would be far more chaotic and fractious if the UN didn't exist at all, and especially if we didn't enjoy the norms and the standards it sets and upholds. These norms and standards are not new inventions. They can be traced back to a basic human compact expressed variously by Jesus, Hillel, the Prophet Muhammad, some form of that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This simple notion is indeed at the heart of civilization, because if you do not observe it, you will pay a price when others fail to do so. In 1948, the General Assembly voted to codify the concept of rights based on that principle into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United Nations can give it unique practical meaning because far more than any single nation, the UN can condemn a human rights violation from a position of neutrality, supported by evidence, and measured against clear standards. No single nation can do that without another nation saying, you're simply talking about human rights as a way of attacking me, because none of us is without sin. And in 1989, the UN came together once again to codify the rights of children through the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which celebrates its 25th anniversary in the coming year. Children have rights because all human beings have rights. The idea of human rights is hardly a novel one, of course, for Americans. Human rights are the pillar of our Declaration of Independence, unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, rights. These rights are not conveyed like a driver's license at the age of 16 or 17 or 18. They belong to children. They are innate. They are equal without regard to gender, economic status, religious belief, disability, or geographic location. But without action, without results, the best aspirations codified in the Convention on the Rights of the Child amount to little more than words on paper. For how can we claim that children's rights are being upheld when 18,000 children under the age of 5 every day die, largely because of causes that we know how to prevent? When a girl in Afghanistan is kept home from school to perform household chores, carrying water and laundry instead of books, while her brothers gain an education. When a mother in Pakistan cannot access a simple polio vaccination for her son because they live in a remote community or because local groups are threatening the workers. When about 1 in 4 American children lives in poverty. Or when, as Canada's Globe and Mail newspaper recently reported, 35% of households in Bridgeport earned less than $25,000 a year, while in Greenwich, 35% of families earned more than $200,000 a year. These inequalities mean that children living less than a 30-minute drive apart will attend dramatically different schools, enjoy dramatically different opportunities, and will live lives that children in the other community can barely imagine. Children's rights are not only human rights. They are at the heart of the aspiration of every parent, every community, and even every country to help our children today have the tools to build a better, healthier, more prosperous tomorrow. What do we call this? Well, it's called here the American Dream, an expression of our country's belief that every person, every child deserves, has the right to a fair opportunity at health and prosperity and dignity. This belief has been self-evident since our country's founding, central to what we are taught about the American experience, American history, and American tradition. And it's a belief that led the U.S. to sign the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1995, when I was in the White House, and in 2002 to also ratify its 2 optional protocols that protect children from involvement in armed conflicts and from sexual exploitation. However, the United States has yet to ratify the convention itself, a distinction we share with only 2 other countries in the world. Every other country in the world has ratified it, except for, can anybody tell me? Somalia and, no, North Korea, the Vatican, South Sudan. Somalia and South Sudan. So how long has South Sudan been around? A couple of years, right? Haven't quite gotten to it yet. And this is my Jon Stewart impersonation. Oh, this just in. I just saw a letter from the President Hassan of Somalia this week saying that they intend now to ratify it. So we will be left completely alone in the world without our friends in Somalia, simply South Sudan, which again didn't exist 2 years ago. As an American, and as part of an organization dedicated to children and their rights, I hope that our country will ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Not only because it's right, as the whole world, save 2 other for now, soon 1 other governments has agreed, but because respecting children's rights supports healthy families. And healthy families are the lifeblood of successful nations. Don't we all, every American believes that. Let me tell you a story. It was a small moment, perhaps, but it made a big point for me. At the rehearsal for my daughter's wedding some years ago in Western Massachusetts, the enlightened, sensitive minister asked her perhaps somewhat enlightened father, me, to lead her down the aisle and give her away to her very enlightened and sensitive about-to-be husband. We took our places, pleased at this very happy ceremony, and I was ready to walk Nell down the aisle as we rehearsed this, and suddenly we were surprised and even shocked when she said wonderfully and very nicely to me, "No." I said, "Why?" And she said, "You can't give me away because you don't own me." There, right, and you know, how many of us just sort of, we say the words, well, you're going to give her away, and da-da-da-da. Completely archaic, but it's even in our own traditional DNA. Give her away the bride. Small thing. Children aren't possessions. Women aren't possessions. Children are blessings to be cherished and nourished and respected and guided and protected. No truly civilized society treats children or women or other human beings as possessions, or should, and that's because they have rights. Certainly children need parental guidance. They need direction. They need discipline. Article 18 of the Convention specifically insists on the fundamental role of parents who have, quote, the primary responsibility for the upbringing and the development of the child. But discipline need not and should not include abuse. A child has a right to be free of abuse. Numerous studies show that abuse is ineffective or worse. In fact, I think we would all agree that a strong family with strong children rests on strong values, not violence. If children are at the heart of the American family, they are also at the heart of the American dream. Because when we make our nation, every nation, a better place for children, when we invest in their health, safety, well-being, and education, we are literally shaping our destiny. It's a cliche that children are our future, but like so many cliches, it's true. Consider this. When a child in the Central African Republic is recruited into an armed group as thousands have been in recent months. When a girl in Afghanistan is told that she's unequal to her brothers and therefore should stay at home instead of attending school. When Syrian children embark on a perilous, terrifying journey to a refugee camp in another country, very far away. Or when an American child is beaten at home. When studies show that if children learn that violence is normal, they are more likely to perpetuate it. When these things happen, what kind of future are we creating? For these children are our future leaders, our doctors and innovators and dreamers and doers. How will they view the world? And how will they one day view their responsibilities to that world and to their own families? Think about the future of Syria. At risk is nothing less than a lost generation of Syrian children, lost to the deprivations and the hatreds that sparked this conflict in the first place. Nearly 5 million children are affected by the brutal conflict there, including over 2 million who are now out of school. 2 million. Over 1 million children have fled to neighboring countries. You know, and I'm saying 2 million, 1 million, 5 million. Every one of those numbers is an individual child. They've fled to neighboring countries, and those countries are themselves already struggling with poverty and deep inequalities. And now over half of these refugee children are not getting an education, and they are being denied the opportunity to gain the skills and sense of civic responsibility they need to rebuild that shattered society. I was in Syria earlier this month, and in Lebanon, to which many Syrian refugees have fled. Unicef is working with our partners to provide drinking water and immunizations and education and psychological counseling and safe places to play that are so important to a child who's gone through these horrors. But so much more needs to be done. Some refugee children are indeed drawing pictures that reveal a very grim insight into their world. Pictures of violence, pictures of revenge, pictures of hopelessness for the future. Let me emphasize how odd this is. I've been to refugee camps in Pakistan after the floods, after the earthquake in Haiti. I've met with children in Afghanistan, all around the world. Everywhere, children are far happier than they have any right to be. It is amazing. I always come away so inspired because they can laugh and play, and even as their parents are in such dire, dire circumstances, they don't know any better. Not the case in Syria, where we are seeing, again, when we have children draw, as you know, draw as a part of their therapy to get over their traumas, the pictures are coming back more and more hopeless, more and more dark, and then with appalling pictures of the child himself with a rifle shooting the people who had done such damage to them. These children have seen too much, too soon, witnessed things that no child should ever see. The potential psychological damage to these children is heartbreakingly real and a threat not only to their own futures, but to the future of a region in which we have such an interest. If we lose this generation of Syrian children to hatred and the habit of violence, we lose our hope for a Syria in which these children someday can successfully rebuild and reconcile. So we can build a better world only if our children have the best possible start in life. Quality health care, nutrition, education, clean water and sanitation, protection from violence, abuse, and exploitation, and a decent standard of living. When we invest in a child's health and nutrition and protection and survival, we do more than just save that child's life. As child survival improves, so of course does then overall life expectancy. And a 1-year improvement in a population's life expectancy is associated with a 4% increase in national economic output. When we invest in a child's education, we set in motion a path towards prosperity and empowerment and inclusion, not just for the individual, but also for societies and economies. each year of schooling translates into a 10% increase in potential income. And most importantly, when we invest in children's futures, we invest in a more hopeful, caring, and peaceful world for all of us. A child who has known health and love in her own life will be more willing and more able to pass hope along to her children, as they too continue in the task of building our common world. We invest, in other words, when we invest in children abroad, we invest in a global version of the American dream, in a fairer future when all children, no matter where they live, no matter what barriers they face, have an equitable opportunity at health and prosperity and opportunity. If any of you have a different definition of the American dream, that every American child should have an equal chance, they'll never end up equal, of course, that's not in human nature, but an equal chance to move up the ladder of progress in the United States. If you have a different definition of the American dream, then I'd love to discuss it. And this is true for the world as well. In a 1953 address to the UN General Assembly, President Eisenhower said, quote, "I know that the American people share my deep belief that if a danger exists in the world, it is a danger shared by all. And equally, that if hope exists in the mind of one nation, that hope should be shared by all." He was talking, of course, about the threat of atomic warfare during the Cold War. But his words also counsel us to consider the threats to our world today: instability, global disease, climate change, conflict, the deprivations endured by too many of the world's children, those who will inherit and shape our common future. Threats that will only become more complex and more urgent if left unchecked. No one country can address them alone in isolation. And so Anita's vision of a strong and active United Nations remains just as vital today as it did when she so inspired me when I came in from the lawn so many years ago. The hope for a better world is universal. We see it everywhere. And if the hope is universal, so too is the responsibility to make that hope real for every child, for every family, for every country, and most certainly for our own. And thank you again, Pete, for having me here.
Thank you.
So please, if you have any questions or any comments, I would ask that you not disguise your comments as questions. What you said is really nonsense, isn't it? Let me know. Sir.
If we were to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what would be the practical impact here in New Canaan? What would be the practical impact in the city of Bridgeport?
Mm-hmm. The convention, of course, is not self-executing. And some of its opponents fear that it would be, and that somehow then the United Nations would be telling you in New Canaan what to do. In fact, it provides then the framework for governments, both national and local, to pass legislation to implement those rights or to protect those rights. So we find it around the world extremely useful when we're going to a government that has ratified the convention to say, why don't you pass a legislation, this is a huge issue actually that I hadn't realized was so big when I joined Unicef, requiring universal and free birth registration. Because huge numbers of children around the world never have their birth registered, and therefore they lack legal rights, the ability to vote, et cetera, later. We can go to them and say, you know, the convention says this, and if they've ratified it, then you have a better argument for it. In the United States, this would rest probably not so much on national legislation, but it gives advocates another argument for passing state legislation that would, I don't know what Connecticut's laws are, but tighten the laws against exploitation of children. trafficking of children, and I bet it happens in this, I'm sure it happens in Connecticut, pornography on the internet. All of these things are covered in various ways by the convention and the two protocols. So it gives you another lever for the advocacy. It is not in itself, as I said, it does not have the legal force that would require this. It depends on the legislation in each nation. And it doesn't have, there are no black helicopters whirling overhead that are about to tell you if you violate one of its provisions, then you're in deep trouble. Again, the implementation of it depends on the governments, including any violations of it. But it is a very powerful tool for advocacy. And as we do that advocacy around the world for children on these heartbreaking issues, we find it very useful. We can work with every government on it in advocating in country X, then country Y and country Z through their embassies or whatever can help us, except for the American embassy, because it hasn't ratified it. As I said, even the Vatican, and other non-governmental organizations. Yeah.
What specifically do the opponents of ratification fear will happen if the United States ratifies?
Well, since we're not sure exactly yet, because unhappily the debate in the Senate hasn't taken place, because, and I understand this, no administration has yet submitted it to the Senate for ratification. I think there are two reasons. One, because it's not at all clear that it would pass. And certainly, I don't think any American can be proud that just over this last year, the Senate rejected the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which actually tracked the American Disabilities Act, but it was rejected. So we don't know exactly what the arguments would be. I think they revolve around, one, the view that Americans have the right to raise their own families in the way they want to, and the UN has no business, or the world has no business, telling Americans how to raise their children. That, of course, is a giant leap from simply saying violence against children begets violence in the next generation and the next, and it's a violation of the children's rights as human beings. And another concern is, and it's not accurate, that the convention would require states to pass certain legislation, and there's a states' rights issue here, which it wouldn't require. So I hope there will be the debate someday on this and we can see the arguments better. I think the other reason why the administration, either Clinton or Bush or now Obama, hasn't submitted it is that there are, and this should concern all of us, because I believe they're all in our interest, even if they are not perfect. There are a series of treaties lined up that have not been submitted to the Senate or ratified by the Senate, including, for example, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And if we are trying to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that's a powerful instrument to use, or the Law of the Sea Treaty. And as the seas do rise a little, as we're seeing now as the ice melts in the Arctic, and the U.S. Navy is now doing a study on how we can be more involved there. And it's not an accident that the Russians arrested the people from Greenpeace, because everybody's seen that the Arctic waters are becoming more a national security interest. We have an interest in the law of the sea that protects our rights there. So there are a lot of treaties stacked up here, and I know that, never mind, I almost said something sarcastic about the U.S. Congress. And I am an international civil servant, and I am not going to say a thing. Sir?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's pretty certain now that the UN troops and peacekeepers introduced cholera to Haiti. Why won't the UN step up to the responsibility?
Let me give you two parts of an answer. I'm going to have to be very careful here because I may not necessarily agree with every semicolon of the UN position. But a part of the issue, first of all, there are those who argue that the science is not completely clear that it was the peacekeepers who created the cholera. On the other hand, I think really just about everybody should agree that the weight of the evidence is that the UN was. I have to be careful here because now we are in a situation in which, and I sympathize with them actually, the victims of the cholera or their families are suing the United Nations. And the heart of the legal issue here, and this is an important point, is that if UN peacekeeping troops are denied their immunities, which they have everywhere, we're not going to have UN peacekeeping troops. And God knows how many people would die as a result. So the lawyers at the UN are very unhappy if anybody says, yes, the UN is responsible. And if the suit proceeds, then lose the immunities, which could have horrible consequences around the world. My own hope is that somehow, because these are victims, without taking on legal responsibility, that the UN or somebody could find some way to do something more for the victims. I went down to Haiti after the cholera epidemic had reached its full flower. And by the way, Unicef and the Pan American Health Organization are doing a lot of work to fight the cholera now, including the introduction of the vaccines that weren't available a few years ago. And the rates of infection are coming down, but it's still there. I went to Haiti, I guess a couple of years ago now, to visit some of the tents that the cholera victims were being treated in. And I remember walking into one, and there was this boy lying on a cot with, and then there's holes in the cot with buckets underneath it, and everybody was in dire shape. And he had on a Barcelona shirt with Messi. Anybody not heard of Messi? I would love to tell you about the Barcelona Football Club with their Unicef logo on the shirt. And there was his Unicef logo and everything, and we talked. And it just reminded me that when you talk about the victims or about the numbers who were infected or not, we are talking about that boy in that shirt. So we're working hard on it, and I hope somebody can find some way to compensate the victims in a way that does not hold the UN legally responsible then if any peacekeeper anywhere does anything wrong, including possibly something horrific like introducing cholera, because then we all suffer. Oh, here, sorry.
I have two questions. First of all, since Afghanistan has signed this thing, and has that helped with, because women are having a little bit more rights, I guess, in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Do you think it's because of this signing, or do you?
Well, okay, the question is the effects in Afghanistan of the agreement that's been reached between the U.S. government just yesterday or the day before, of an agreement between the American government and Karzai, which would, and which really it was very unclear even just a few days ago whether that agreement could be reached. It was a very difficult negotiation that will allow American troops to stay in at much lower levels after the bulk of American forces leave next year. And the question is, has it had an effect yet? Well, it just was signed. And one thing that's very interesting in the New York Times tomorrow will be very interesting about this, because I heard about it on the radio this morning, is that Karzai had summoned what's called the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, which is a huge gathering of thousands of tribal leaders, local officials, politicians, religious leaders, et cetera, all sort of handpicked, in fact, by Karzai and the government, who've come together over the last few days. And 2 days ago, Karzai, to the surprise, not for the first time, and I don't, by the way, do diplomacy anymore, so this is not UNICEF, this is me. Anyway, to the surprise of the Americans and everybody, after having said, I don't trust the Americans and the Americans don't trust me, said that while he had reached the agreement, that he hadn't signed it, and he didn't want to sign it until after the elections next year. This morning I heard on the radio that the Loya Jirga which was handpicked by him, told him overwhelmingly and unanimously, no, you should sign it now, and we need to move forward. Either he handpicked them very badly, or this is great theater that he'd put up, or something. I don't, or we'll find out probably tomorrow or the next day why this happened. But anyway, I think it's good news. And I think it's good news because if the American influence in Afghanistan is withdrawn too quickly, and let's hope that it is withdrawn over time, and I think we should be glad that most of the troops are coming home, not only could it have a destabilizing effect on in a region that is important to us, but my concern would be that in Afghanistan today, there are, and I was just in Afghanistan before I was in Syria and Lebanon, and I saw these kids in school, there are 2 million girls in school, I think that's the number, in Afghanistan. In 2001-2, there were none. And I don't want to see those 2 million girls who suddenly have hope in their lives lose it because the place falls apart completely and they are no longer able to build their own futures. Sorry, and you had a second question.
These refugee camps in Lebanon,
Mm-hmm.
are they made up of both sides or just the so-called people against the side?
Yeah, interesting question. It's depends on which border they've come across and which affected population. So from the areas that are more Alawite, supporting the government, they spill across mostly into Lebanon, and there they tend to be more, not pro-government, but kind of, yeah. But certainly scared of the Sunnis. And then in the camps in Jordan, for example, they tend to be more Sunni and more opposed to the government. You mentioned Lebanon. I came away from my trip there 2 weeks ago or less, very concerned about the future of the country. And one reason is because of the increasing involvement of Hezbollah, which is dominant in the south of Lebanon, in the Syrian conflict, which means that now the Shia and the Sunnis in Lebanon are starting to carry out bomb attacks against each other, which is destabilizing. But also, unlike Turkey and Jordan, Lebanon doesn't have any refugee camps. So the people who have come across into Lebanon in very large numbers, because it's right along the area of fighting now between Damascus and Homs and Aleppo, those people have no camps to go to. They are, and they are going into the poorest parts of Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley, and there are no camps to go to, so they are trying to live in the host communities, and traditional Arab hospitality is trying to take them in. But the resentments are growing hugely between these communities and the refugees who are overwhelming their services, taking jobs, et cetera. Or more and more now, and thousands and thousands just came across over the last few days in an area just north of where I was because of severe fighting just across the border. There's no communities to take them in. So the ones I was visiting were, and these are people who are used to living a better life, middle-class people. I'm not saying they deserve better than rural Africans in the Sahel, but the people suffering so terribly in the Sahel have done it before. These people have no idea how to live this way. They have nothing. They just left and rushed across the border, and are literally, the community I visited, it's not a community, are mothers and children, because the men, well, I'll skip that, but anyway, are mostly mothers and children, living on the land that a landlord has providing them and then charging them an exorbitant rent and letting them go into debt over it. Their children are then having to help out by working in the local fields during the summer, which is a violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and their only income, which is a bit of a dilemma. living literally under canvas sheets stretched over trees or however, as if you had suddenly gone out and had to live outside New Canaan with none of your possessions on land that's not yours. And the snow's coming in a month or two. So we are desperately, to all of them that we can, sending in warm clothing. I visited a medical clinic with a local partner trying to take care of them. We have a makeshift school that we set up in a tent so the kids have something of a safe space. There was a girl. Well, actually, I didn't meet her at first, but I was with some children who were playing, and I loved sitting there and just playing with the kids, talking to them, whatever. And there was, the kids had been making dolls, which seems to be a theme. I remember in Pakistan, a girl telling me about the doll that she had left behind when the floods came, and that's all she could talk about. And there were a bunch of these dolls, and there was one that was particularly pretty, so I asked if I could talk to the girl who had made it, and they said she wasn't there, but they would find her, which I hadn't asked them to bother her, but anyway. And so I got away the cameras and everything, and I just went and talked to her for a while. And I asked her about the doll, and she said that this doll, whose name was Maman or something, was her doll, but that her other doll, Maman, the same name, was in her house in Syria. And she is staying in the house to protect the house from when I come home. And let's pray.
A comment leading to a question. For me, you talked this afternoon very much as an American as well as...
Well, I don't usually.
I know.
Yeah. In fact, I've discovered now, I'm finding myself as an international civil service referring to the Americans. And then remembering, wait a minute. Anyway, please.
This afternoon it was fun. You're in the right place. And you talked about some of the values that, I consider some of our best and oldest values, and values we used to share. My question is this. I'm one of those who thinks we have begun to lose our way as a country. We are more divided than any other time in my memory. The first step towards getting out of trouble is to ask yourself, how deep is the hole? So I'm curious, as an American, how deep is the hole, and what are your thoughts on what we do to get out?
This really is a long way from UNICEF.
But it's inherent in everything you said.
No, it is. I think the second question is not just how deep is the hole, but is it getting deeper? And I don't see, because I obviously read the New York Times, watch television, I'm passionate about the future of our country and what's going on, and I think it is getting deeper. I fear that when we look for fixes and what to do about it, because the 1950s were terrible. And if you go back and look at McCarthyism and the divisions in the United States then and the victims of those divisions, it was at least as bad as today, and we recovered from that. Why did we recover? Well, I fear that we tend often to look for institutional fixes to our problems. And of course that's important. So we're going to pass a law here or a new Senate rule there or whatever, and those are important. But what matters most of all is belief. And in a way, I'm just thinking out loud here, but in a way, what's really the struggle here is not Democrats and Republicans or Senate rules or whatever. It are the values that got us through the 1950s when people like Eisenhower and others said, no, this is wrong, and took a stand because of the values that you were just saying that we all share, and we have to fix it, or have we started to accommodate because of the virulence of the television things that we watch, because we all love to see a good fight. The Patriots tonight. And I've got to leave soon to get back to, no, but are those values so ingrained in us that we will make a stand somehow and say, no, we have to come back to making our system work, that we will penalize politicians on either side who are more interested in politics than policy, et cetera? Or are we so used to it now, sort of like Syrian children, I don't mean to make the parallel, who have seen violence and think it's normal? Do we think that this is normal now? Does a younger generation of Americans, do they prefer the entertainment on television of politicians not getting anything done but screaming at each other? Or will we have the traditional values that say, no, it's got to stop, and start to penalize those who don't do it? And I don't know the answer to that. It's another great reason for good education, so that people understand our history and understand why our hopes should be rooted in that history and in those values that have allowed us always to survive dark periods before. Early 1930s, dark. 1950s, dark. I'm an optimist. I think we will in the end. No, you don't get a question because I'm driving you back. It's my sister and I'm driving her back to New York. What? A comment? Okay.
Who are your great allies in your effort to achieve what you hope to do? Is the religious world backing you and working closely with you? How about the educational world?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And in fact, there are, you mean on which?
Achieving the rights of the children.
Oh, yes. No, they're actually, while they're not organized in the Senate yet, like the caucus already opposing it, even though it hasn't been introduced yet, there is a coalition of religious groups, human rights groups, all kinds of groups in civil society who are waiting to act on this. And including, as I said, and then other governments who I'm sure will, I hope, tactfully encourage the right thing in the United States to have happen. And since I believe this, the best argument, because it happens to be true, is that this makes strong families if you respect the rights of your children. This is not an attack on American families. It's a strengthening of what American families are and can be even more. And so the more we can get religious groups speaking up for traditional American family values built around healthy, well-educated, and protected children, then I think maybe we can win it. And they're out there, but they're not rallied yet because the fight hasn't begun. And since I'm scareder of my sister than I was of Anita Houston, did you have a comment? You said?
I was just going to say, I'm not quite sure how to put this, but I moved here as a 9-year-old in 1945, and I have lots and lots of memories of New Canaan in those days, and I love New Canaan, but the change from then in terms of prejudice, assumptions, it's why I'm more cheerful than some. I've seen such changes, and
Yeah.
for the better.
No, that's true.
Could you repeat that?
My sister, who went on living here in New Canaan, is saying that just in New Canaan you can see the change for the better in terms of inclusiveness and et cetera, and therefore we can be hopeful. And I think that's right. If you take a very long view, you can see the progress over time. But we certainly, progress comes like this. And right now we're at the bottom of the sine curve. Yes?
I appreciate your lecture very much. I had a question about your foreign policy background and reconciling that with humanitarian priorities. I was also in the Middle East over the summer and saw firsthand the Syrian refugee crisis, but also the Palestinian refugee crisis that has been somewhat undealt with for the last 70 years. And given your experience in the government, how do you reconcile foreign policy objectives and humanitarian priorities?
Well, as I was trying to suggest, I think that, I mean, to put it very simply, the healthier a society is abroad, the more stable it is. The more stable it is, the less we are, just speaking from a classic national security point of view, the less likely we are to be faced with that terrible choice of, do we intervene at a huge cost when we don't know exactly what's going on, we could get stuck, et cetera, or do we turn our backs and not do anything and then pay a larger price as it gets worse and worse, and pay a price in our collective conscience as well. So the more we can be dealing with potential crises which are rooted in, almost invariably, in local fights over resources or ethnic tensions or all of the reasons that we all know, then the more we're serving our long-term national, political, and security interests. And I think that's almost obvious, but you forget about it when you're dealing in the short run with these problems. The other point would be that if you look at the Palestinians, and by the way, UNRWA, I was saying to somebody at lunch, UNRWA, which is the UN refugee organization dealing with the Palestinians, are running short of money. So I've just, when I read this in the New York Times 5 days ago, I called the head of UNRWA because UNICEF's doing pretty well in our fundraising. By the way, as I tell our folks, our budget this year, which is about $4 billion, all of which we raise ourselves, and when our folks, and it's increasing, and when our folks say, "Ooh, look at us, look at all the money we're raising," I remind them, if you can't raise money for children, because every human being is hardwired to want to see children do well, do not go into the used car business, because you will fail miserably. But anyway, so I called the head of UNRWA, and I said, because this is not usual, can I help you fundraise for UNRWA? And the reason, and I'll be meeting with him on Monday, and the reason is that if the Palestinian children if the teachers now aren't getting salaries because UNRWA is running short of money, this is, by the way, a disguised appeal for UNRWA. And remember, as you write the UN in UNRWA, there's also an ICEF that you can put in. Anyway, never mind. But if those children are growing up the way other generations of Palestinians have grown up, then the chances of someday achieving a peace with Israel, which is so much in our own interest, are severely diminished. So the two come together. By the way, you mentioned that Republican opposition had prevented President Clinton from succeeding and wanted me to be his CIA director. This was led, I actually had the votes. They wouldn't bring it to a vote in the Senate. The Republican chair of the Intelligence Committee. And I would like to note that I look on him with tremendous retrospective affection, because if I had been the head of the CIA, I never could have had the best job I've ever had in my life, and that is running UNICEF. I just love it every morning.
I'd like to go back to October 31st, when the children came to the house and they said, "Trick or treat." For years, we had saved all of our coins, not Bitcoin, but other real coins, our quarters and so on.
Yeah.
All of our change, and we had lots of it. And the kids used to have UNICEF bags, and we filled those bags gladly. We noticed that most recently, no child has carried a UNICEF bag, and we haven't seen any of them with those bags. It's because there seems to be some either lack of interest or perhaps no education about UNICEF in the schools that tell the kids during trick or treat time, please take your little bags and ask for a contribution for UNICEF. Why don't the teachers do that anymore?
Well, good, because I mean, my grandchildren are out there with their orange boxes up in Western Massachusetts. In my office, there's a big competition between two schools on who can raise more. And so I would hope that I'm pinning you, would go to the teachers and say, let's do this more. It's from when I was the chair of the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, and let me explain that UNICEF, which I run, or try not to get in the way, is the organization that does the work. Right? The U.S. Fund for UNICEF, which I used to chair, is one of 36 or so national committees around the world in relatively well-off countries that then raise private money for UNICEF and are separate legal entities, 501c3 philanthropies, that raise the money for it. When I was the chair, I remember we discussed this at great length because trick or treat is labor intensive. And it's one of the least profitable of the various things that the U.S. Fund does to raise money. But my point, and so far I think everybody's agreed, is that may be the case, but every one of those children will then remember UNICEF someday and help create the base for our future welfare. So we're still pushing it, and I do hope that you will push it here. I will never reveal when I used to do it whether I was hoping for the cash for UNICEF or the candy for me. How long do you want to go on?
I'd say 2 more.
Okay, 2 more? Yeah. Who have we got? You were there first, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit, going back to the Clinton administration, the situation in Rwanda. And this leads into the concept of the responsibility to protect, which was developed by Kofi Annan in the aftermath of that. I was wondering if you could tell us, I know it was in the aftermath of Black Hawk Down and all this, but as a UN retiree, I remember talking to some folks in the peacekeeping department, and they said that 15,000 well-armed Marines could have stopped the genocide there. And I was wondering if you could comment on this, and what the U.S. government role was then.
Not just the U.S. government's role, but my role, because I was the National Security Advisor during that. I have spoken about this often, because if you don't face your mistakes, then you never learn and you don't do better in the future. And I think about Rwanda, not enough of that has been done. Though, let me say parenthetically, if you're going to discuss Rwanda and what you learn, then you have a responsibility to apply it in the Darfurs or today the Central African Republic, which could go in the same direction, and I think is sliding in that direction, and we're doing everything we can to call attention to it with the American and other governments. What was it? I think that I know, because I went back and looked at all the documents in my files and others that I could see, that and anything I say is not to excuse it, is to explain it, right? Because there's no excuse for what happened, and if I could take any decision over again, it would be that in my whole life. But the point is that it was never a decision. There was never, if you go back, I know I was at the time obsessed with Bosnia and Haiti and a series of other issues, and fighting battles with some of my colleagues over those issues. Randall Robinson, the head of Trans-Africa, was on a hunger strike about Haiti. And we simply didn't pay attention. There was, unlike most decisions, there was never a meeting of the National Security Council or the Principals Committee that I chaired on what should we intervene in Rwanda or not. And there was lousy intelligence, but there were reports in the newspapers. And we should have said, and I should have said, what's going on here? And then asked the intelligence community to find out and tell us more about what was going on. And of course, it was a relatively quick thing, so that it was just over a couple of months, so that by the time we started catching up, rather than doing the things that we did do on the periphery, because I can remember meeting with a human rights activist from Rwanda who told me this amazing story about hiding in her attic and then escaping, and discussing with her what we should do. And she said, list the people who were carrying this out, and we did that, but never said, should we intervene or not? Now, I don't think there were 15,000 Marines. I'm not sure, and Kofi Annan's been blamed a lot because he was heading the peacekeeping office. To get the peacekeepers recruited, as you know, would have taken a long time and probably insufficient. And for sure, while we weren't influenced by Black Hawk Down, again, because we never even had the discussion we should have had, the Congress would have rejected a call for intervention under the War Powers Act. None of that matters. We should have had that meeting. We should have made those decisions. We should have said either yes or no. I would hope that many of us would have argued for yes and then failed with the Congress. The sin was in not paying attention, and that's, I think, the big lesson there. And let's learn that lesson right today about the Central African Republic, because right now, in a very different way, we could see that state completely fail and massive bloodshed, not organized as in Rwanda, but a kind of the Lord of the Flies writ large there. And thank you for asking. One last. I saw. Oh yes, you had your hand up. I'm sorry. I'll see you later.
Sorry. I'm just curious if you have any perspectives that you could offer. You cited earlier that 70 or 90% support of the American public for the UN versus sort of this misgiving or even hostility that the UN treaties frequently seem to encounter in Congress. Is it strictly special interests lobbying against them, or is there something?
No, I don't think it's special interests. I think it's, and this is, go back to the mid-19th century, and there was the Know Nothing Party, where I'm not comparing them to any, quickly let me say, because UNICEF has a wide range of support across both Republicans and Democrats, again, who wouldn't love children. But the Know Nothing Party back in the mid-19th century, in the early 1930s, contributing to the isolationism were a lot of groups who were simply saying the world is a wicked, evil place and the United States mustn't become infected by it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long history of this, so this is not new, but I think this is more visceral than reasoned. And I think it is a part of a view of America that we are so special and so different that we can play by different rules from everybody else, and because God is on our side. I don't mean to put it in religious terms, but this has always been our view. It has helped us create some of the greatest things we've ever done, but it has also meant, I believe, that it has severely limited our influence in the world and our defense of our own interests, because it does isolate us in the way we're seeing now on the convention, and on so many other things as well. And thank God for the UN Association here. Oh, and I received an envelope. I have not opened it, but I know it is a contribution to UNICEF, and I want to thank you. It's actually not a contribution to UNICEF. It's a contribution through UNICEF to the children. And thank you for that very much.
Thank you for coming, everyone, today. And please, everyone is invited upstairs in the gallery for a reception with Tony and his friends and family. Thank you.